What I wanted to finish this on is the timeline, because what I love about covering these different books is that I try to compare them all and see how the timelines fit. And sure enough, Ralph Roberts, as I told you, gets into Reno around 7 p.m. on July 20th, 1960. Marilyn gets in, it says in James Good's book that I covered earlier, that she arrived in Reno at 2:45 p.m. at the airport. And Paula told Ralph Roberts when he called her, when he got up to the 8th floor of the Mapes Hotel, that Marilyn had just gotten in that afternoon. So we know for a fact they both arrived at Reno on the 20th of July, 1960. And the interesting thing about that date, also according to James Good's book, is he recorded, she got into the airport and then into Frank Taylor's red 1960 Thunderbird convertible. They get the picture. It's like a parade. They get a picture of her standing up under the biggest little city in the world sign on Virginia Street, which is right near the Mapes Hotel. It's just a block or two away. And then in his book, James Good, he chronicles all the shots of the movie. So that morning, they were shooting a railway scene when Clark Gable is saying goodbye to actress Marietta Tree. She played Susan. Clark Gable played Gay Langland. And Guido was driving up in his truck, played by Eli Wallach, and the train was stopped there. Marietta Tree was getting on, and Guido was there on the street waiting for the lights to change. And he sees Gable over to the side, and he says, hey, Gay, how's it going? And Gabe waves back to Guido and says, hey, I was just about to call you. And that's when he tells Susan, telling her goodbye, and she says, oh, I'm really going to miss you. And she gets on. And the interesting thing about, real quick, on Marietta Tree, because there's all these connections, she was the former lover or girlfriend of director John Huston. They were both big-time Democrats. She was like a Democratic operative in New York City. She lived on the Upper East Side. She was a debutante. She lived in this big mansion over there. And she was flying out to San Francisco, and she said, let me just say hello to John on the way over there, because they still remained good friends. And when she got over there to see him, they were sitting like at the Mapes Hotel for breakfast. There was Gable and Huston. And Huston was saying, we need this part. We need a lady to play this one short scene when you're saying goodbye to one of these divorcees that came out from St. Louis. We need someone. And Gable looked over and saw Marietta sitting just across the way. And he said, what about her? And John Huston looked over and he's thinking, yeah, this was my former girlfriend. She looks the part. And they did a couple of auditions, and sure enough, she got the part. And this was just like the day before, or 2 days before. And Marietta was very nervous. She did the part. She gets on the train, and she was worried because the train was heading towards San Francisco. So apparently she had her bags, and she didn't want to leave without her bags in the hotel. And it turns out the train stopped. So the interesting thing there, the train should have been going east to St. Louis, because she told Gay Langland in the film, Susan did, I got the second biggest laundry in all of St. Louis. And Gay Langland said to her, you know what, sorry, Susan, but I'm not cut out for business. Remember, they don't like wages. So that was the first scene they did that morning of the 20th. Then they wrap that up and they go over to the USO building across town. And they filmed the scene when Eli Wallach is driving up. Keep in mind, he's the mechanic, driving up the driveway, and Rosalind, that would be Marilyn Monroe's character, her white Cadillac convertible, 1959 Cadillac, was all beat up. She had gotten in an accident, and Guido, the mechanic, was inspecting it probably for insurance purposes or for repairs if they were going to repair it. And Monroe later, Rosalind said, "I'll never drive that car again." So who knows what they did with it. And then Thelma Ritter comes out in that scene, and she has a clock in her hand, and she goes, "I have 7 clocks in this house, and none of them work." So that scene was where Guido parks it. He's walking around the Cadillac, and Thelma Ritter's character, Isabel, the owner of the boarding house where Rosalind was staying, comes out and says, she should get a very good price. And they're talking about how, her husband sends her a potted yellow rose every year. She got divorced as well. And the reason Rosalind is staying there at her boarding house is she came from Chicago back east to get a divorce from the character Raymond Tabor, who played her husband, who was her husband in the movie, played by Kevin McCarthy. And she was staying there and she was on the 2nd floor. And that scene, they spliced in that part into that scene because, keep in mind, they're filming this around noontime on the 20th. Marilyn Monroe gets in at 2:45 to the Reno airport. She's not even on the set yet. And so what they probably did was Guido drives up, he's inspecting the car. Isabel comes out, they're talking a little bit, and then she realizes that they're late. She asks Guido, I believe, "What time is it?" And he says like 9:20 or something. And she looks up. She would have looked up at the window and called out to Rosalind, "Hey, Rosalind, are you almost ready? We got to get going." I think they did that one scene the next day. So that day, they just did the conversations with Guido and Isabel discussing, hey, she should get a good price for the car. It only has like 10 miles on it. And it was like a gift from her husband, Raymond, who was played by Kevin McCarthy, apparently to keep her from getting a divorce. And Guido says, "Oh, they're giving divorce presents now?" And so that whole conversation was hilarious. And that it was all banged up because the Reno men were smashing into it just to talk to Rosalind because she was so beautiful. And by the way, they did not get another Cadillac that was already banged up from like a junkyard. Maybe they had trouble finding one, but I believe it was sacrilege because to get that car looking like that, the stagehands got these huge sledgehammers and banged away at the fins, at the front fender, and ruined that beautiful 1959 Cadillac. It had leather seats, and as car collectors know today, it's like one of the meccas of classic cars. It's like from the Finn era, everybody wants that car. You can't find one, especially the Eldorados like you would see in my curio cabinet. You can't get one of those for under like $300,000. So I believe the movie was cursed from the very beginning. Keep in mind they had a lot of delays, and Marilyn wasn't feeling well. She got sick. They got bad weather, and she had to go back to LA. They ran way over budget, and 12 days after the last shot of Monroe and Clark Gable that they did at Paramount Studios on the 4th of November 1960, 12 days later, Clark Gable tragically died. So the movie was cursed from the very beginning. On the set of Let's Make Love, which rumor said that Marilyn Monroe had an affair with Yves Montand, the leading actor in that movie. And there was an actor's strike, and then she got up to Reno with very little sleep, and very little rest, and it was blazing hot because everything got pushed back to July of 1960. They should have been filming in early 60 or late 1959, and everything just went wrong. So I believe the movie was cursed because of the Cadillac. The other thing is that very rarely would they film out of sequence. It was a point by Arthur Miller and producer Frank Taylor and also director John Huston to try to film in sequence as much as possible. And that's what I love about this movie. In James Good's book, everything was sequential, and it made it easy to follow. And it also would make it easier for the actors to get in the character as well. But in this sequence on the 20th, they filmed the railway station scene with Gable, Guido, and Marietta Tree. That's Gable, Eli Wallach, and Marietta Tree around 8 a.m. on the 20th. They wrapped that up and went over to the USO building, the boarding house, and filmed the scene with Eli Wallach and Thelma Ritter. And those were out of sequence because in the movie, the very first scene was Guido driving up behind the Cadillac, inspecting it, and Thelma coming out. The next scene would have been at the courthouse. He ends up driving Marilyn Monroe and Thelma Ritter to the Washoe County courthouse, and that's when Marilyn comes out and she's going up to get her divorce, and sure enough, Kevin McCarthy, playing her husband Raymond Tabor, is on the steps. She goes up and he's trying to keep her from getting the divorce. He wanted to reconcile with her. That's scene number 2. Then scene number 3 would have been when they film it at the train station and Gay Langland's saying goodbye to Susan, and then he goes over to Guido's truck and they're discussing going Mustanging, and they would meet at Harrah's later. And then the next scene after that would be when Marilyn had left the courthouse. She got a successful divorce, and she's standing there by the Truckee Bridge, and that's when Thelma Ritter tells Marilyn, "Hey, why don't you throw your ring in? It's good luck." And she was smart. She may need that later to pawn off, because now she doesn't have this sugar daddy that was giving her everything. So that's the sequence it would have been. And real quick, because I always wondered about this stuff, but when you put together several different books, it becomes one mosaic, and it all matches well. In the scene that they shot at the boarding house, you got Guido driving up in the truck, played by Eli Wallach. He's inspecting the Cadillac. Then Thelma Ritter with the clock, and then they're talking, and then I think that's all they filmed on that day. The next day would have been Marilyn's first scene of the movie. So that would have taken place in the morning of July 21st, 1960. If Ralph Roberts actually gave her that first massage the day that they got in, hopefully she slept well. So the next morning, that's when you first see Marilyn Monroe. She looks out the window on the second story of the boarding house, and there's like a screen, and you can barely see her, but she looks down to Isabel. Yeah, give me 5 minutes. First scene of the Misfits. That was shot the next day, and they spliced it in to the shots of Thelma Ritter and Eli Wallach on the previous day, which was the day Marilyn flew in from Los Angeles. And then they did that little scene. They grafted it into the movie. They edited it into the movie. And then they go upstairs and they actually shoot. In James Good's book, they're talking about they actually shot in a room upstairs in the boarding house. And that's when Marilyn has her John Louis negligee. and she's putting on her lipstick and at the same time her makeup and trying to learn these lines that Isabel gave to her. Basically lies she's going to tell about her husband, how he beat her up and abused her verbally. And Isabel said, don't worry about it. The judges don't care out here. The courts are a joke. Just learn the lines. And it was a tiny room, and Miller, this would have been his first screenplay, so everything he did was on Broadway. And he mentioned how everything in movie making seems so small. Everyone's crammed in to this small room that's probably like 8 by 11. And on Broadway, everything is huge. You know, you got the huge stage, you got the audience, and everything is in immediate response. And in movie making, it's this long, drawn-out process. You say cut, then you say take, then you say action again, and then you keep doing the scenes over. And that's another thing. Marilyn typically would forget her lines, and you have to do the scenes over and over. And throughout the filming of the Misfits, she was always late on set. And they said it was a lot because, James Good said, because they kept changing the script on her, and she always, since she was young, had trouble memorizing her script, and she always got very worried. So Paula Strasberg was also not just her acting coach, but like a psychiatrist on set, a psychologist for moral support. And she mentioned of Roberts that it was great to have him there as well, not just for the massages at night at 9 p.m. and then in the middle of the night, but also in the mornings when they go to the set. She would give her a neck massage, and then while Whitey Snyder is putting on her makeup, then Agnes puts on the wig. Then he said this continued the same way throughout shooting. Then Paula would come over, go over her lines, they get in the Cadillac, they do the shots, and then in between takes, if it was going to take a while, if they were doing some rewrites or whatever, or a break, he would also give her some massages, and there are plenty of pictures of that throughout the movie. Over at the Styx Ranch, he's giving her a massage, and then you have Montgomery Clift goofing around behind him and with the bandages, and then the shot over at Pyramid Lake when he's giving her a massage. So that was the typical pattern that you would see with Roberts on the set of the Misfits. So my name is Ray Capote for the Misfits Mystique. Thank you for watching, and as always, cheers.